My name is Alvin Reyes, and for a long time I was what they called a compliant. That was the word the Consortium used for human beings who held a contract on Halberd Station without making trouble. I held my contract for 9 years. I filed shipping manifests for the Vesian Freight Authority, ate the gray protein they issued us on alternating shifts, and slept in a cabin the size of a coffin standing on its end. I was 43 years old when the trouble started. I tell you that not because age matters, but because by 43 a man knows what kind of life he has settled for, and what he is willing to do to keep it. I had settled for very little, and I was willing to do almost anything. That is how they catch you. They count on it. Halberd Station rode in a slow elliptical above what used to be the eastern seaboard. From the observation gallery on Deering, you could see the dark patch where New York had been, and on a clear pass the lights of the new Consortium harvesting platforms strung out across the coast like a necklace on a corpse. The Vesian had not invaded in the way the old stories warned us about. They had bought. They had arrived in the year I was 19 with offers, with treaties, with smooth voices and longer patience than any human negotiator. They leased land. They leased labor. By the time my father died, they owned the patents on 3/4 of our crops and the water rights underneath my mother's hometown. By the time I signed my own contract, the word invasion did not even apply anymore. There was nothing to invade. We had handed the keys over one office at a time. The Vesian themselves I rarely saw in the flesh. Most of the supervisors on Halberd were synthetics or human administrators who had earned their way up the contract ladder. But once a quarter, a real Vesian would come through the freight office for inspection, and I would have to stand at my console and not flinch while one of them passed behind me. They were tall and soft. That is the only honest way to put it. Tall, soft, and wet. Their torsos were vertical sacks of pale muscle that pulsed when they breathed, and beneath that hung a fringe of tendrils they used the way we used hands. They had 4 eyes, set in a flat ring around the upper sac, and the eyes never blinked because they had no lids. They smelled like the inside of a clam shell. Their voices came from a translator pinned at the base of the sac, and the translators were always set to a calm, almost grandfatherly tone, regardless of which Vesian was speaking. That was the thing that unnerved me most. I could not tell their moods apart. Every one of them sounded like he was about to forgive me for something. I worked alongside 3 other compliants on the freight desk. Frank Doyle had the seat next to mine, and he had been on Halberd longer than anyone I knew. Frank was 61, bald on top, and ran his hand over his scalp whenever he was thinking, as though the hair might have grown back when he was not looking. He had buried 2 wives before he ever signed a Consortium contract, and the Vesian had bought him for the price of the second wife's funeral. He never complained about it. He told me once on a slow 3rd shift with the lights down that he had figured a long time ago that the price of a man was a finite number, and once you knew yours, you stopped being afraid of what came after. I told him I did not know mine yet. He said, "Son, that is because you have not been asked." Nicole Ramos worked the late slot. She had been a paramedic on the surface before her city was repossessed, and she carried the steady hands of that old job into the new one. Cliff Arano handled customs flags. He was a small, angry man, 50-something, who had run a hardware store in Trenton and now spent his nights memorizing freight codes in case the Vesian ever decided he was redundant. And then there was Lester. Lester Pinkham was 19, fresh off a youth contract, and he laughed too easily at things that were not funny. I think Lester believed, on some level, that if he kept laughing the Vesian would keep him around. I do not say that to be cruel. We all had our methods. There was one more thing about my life on Halberd that I have to tell you before we get to the night it all came apart, and that is the matter of the ideal program. The Consortium had been selling them for 6 years by the time my number came up. The advertisements were everywhere on the station feeds. A companion of your own, customized, devoted, forever yours for the term of your contract. They came in 3 models. The basic, which was barely more than a household helper. The intermediate, which could hold a conversation, cook, run a small business if you needed one. And the premium, the ideal 3, which the brochures described as indistinguishable from a fully realized human person. The premium was not cheap. A compliant of my grade could put down 20% of his quarterly pay against one and still take 2 years to finish the contract. But the Consortium offered them on credit, the way they offered everything, and almost every man on the station who had been there longer than 5 years had eventually said yes. I had said no for 9 years. I am not going to pretend that was virtue. It was partly virtue, and partly the fact that I had loved a woman once, a real one, and I did not believe a manufactured woman could come close to her, and I did not want to be the kind of man who learned otherwise. Her name was Maria. She had stayed on the surface when I came up. The Consortium had revoked her movement permit while my contract was being processed, and by the time I tried to apply for a family clause, she had already taken work in a Vetian agricultural enclave, and the address she had given me stopped answering letters. I told myself, for a long time, that she was alive somewhere, and I would find her when my contract ran out. I told myself that for 6 years. I had stopped telling myself that around the 7th. The night the trouble started was a Tuesday on the station calendar, 3rd shift, and Frank was running his hand over his scalp. "They put a new one in my row," he said. I did not look up. A new what? "A wife." He said the word the way a man says a foreign currency. "Premium, Ideal 3, came in this afternoon while I was on shift. They had her waiting in the cabin when I got back." "You didn't order one." I know I didn't order one. He was still rubbing his head. I would remember. I turned to look at him then. Frank Doyle did not joke about money, and an Ideal 3 was money. I asked him what he had done. "I logged it," he said. "I sent the freight ID up to administration, said there had been a delivery error. I told them I had not authorized the purchase and they should pull her back and refund the credit they had not actually charged me yet. And the supervisor on duty was a Vetian, Vasic, I think, the one with the gray rim around the third eye." "What did he say?" Frank stopped rubbing his head. "He said the unit had been gifted to me, loyalty bonus. He said I should enjoy her." I did not know what to say to that. The Vetian did not give gifts. They sold and they leased. A loyalty bonus in 9 years of working for them was a half-day off your shift on the anniversary of your signing. They did not give 20,000 credit synthetics to bald freight clerks. "What's she like?" I said finally, because I could not think of anything else. Frank's face did something I had not seen on it before. He looked frightened. He looked frightened in the way a man looks when he has just understood that the room he is in is not the room he thought it was. He said, very quietly, "She looks like my wife, my second wife, the one who died." I said, "That is a coincidence. They have a catalog." He shook his head. "She has the mole behind her left ear, the one Joanne had from the chemo. They don't put moles like that on a catalog model, Alvin. Nobody asks for that." I did not sleep well that night. I told myself Frank was tired, or paranoid, or remembering wrong. I told myself a lot of things, but I could not get the image out of my head of a 61-year-old man sitting up in his cabin in front of a manufactured woman with his dead wife's chemo scar, and I could not stop thinking about what kind of operation needed to know what your dead wife had looked like behind her left ear. The next shift, Frank did not come in. Cliff covered his row. Nicole worked late and covered the overflow. Lester laughed at the empty chair the way Lester laughed at most things, and I told him to sit down and shut up, and he did, and that was the only mercy I gave anyone that day. I sent 2 queries to Frank's cabin and got an automated response both times saying the resident was unavailable. At end of shift, I walked to Deering myself and pinged the door. The door opened, and Frank stood there in yesterday's clothes. And behind him, sitting on the edge of his bunk with her hands folded in her lap, was a woman of about 50 with chemo-thin hair growing back. She smiled at me when she saw me. She smiled the way a wife smiles when her husband's friend has come over for a beer. She said, "You must be Alvin. Frank has told me about you, and Frank stood in the doorway and did not say anything at all. I asked him in a low voice if he was all right. He said he was fine. He said he had not been sleeping well, but he was fine. The woman behind him said, "Do you want to come in, Alvin? I can make you something." I said no thank you. I told Frank to take a shift off if he needed it, and I went back down the corridor with my stomach in my throat. The woman had not been wrong about anything, and that was the problem. She had said his name like she had known him for 30 years. She had been wearing a robe I had seen Joanne in once, in an old picture Frank kept in his locker. That was the first night I started keeping a notebook, not a station device. An actual paper notebook, the kind you could buy from the commissary for 2 credits, intended for shopping lists and prayer notes. I wrote down what Frank had said. I wrote down what the woman had said. I wrote down the date and the time and the cabin number, and I put the notebook under the false bottom of my footlocker, because something in me, even then, before I knew anything, had begun to understand that there was going to come a time when I would need a record that the Consortium had not seen. A week later, Cliff got one. His was younger, mid-30s, dark hair, big laugh, called him Clifford the way nobody on the station had ever called him. Cliff handled it differently from Frank. Cliff went to administration and made noise. Cliff filed a refusal of unsolicited delivery and demanded the unit be removed from his cabin. The supervisor on duty was a human, an administrator named Reston who had come up through the contract ladder and made a small career out of telling other humans to behave. Reston told Cliff that an ideal companion, once placed, could only be removed at the recipient's expense, and that the expense would be deducted from his quarterly. Cliff said he had not ordered her. Reston said the placement records showed otherwise. Cliff said the placement records were wrong. Reston smiled the small smile of a man who had stopped finding humans interesting some years before, and said the placement records were never wrong. Cliff came back to the freight desk that afternoon shaking. He told me about it in a whisper. He said, "Alvin, she knows things about me. She knows things only my ex-wife knew, my real wife, the one I was married to in Trenton." I said, "Where is your ex-wife now, Cliff?" He looked at me with his small, angry face. He said, "I don't know. The Veshan took the eastern seaboard the year after she left me. I have not heard from her in 15 years. I do not know if she is alive." I wrote that down too. By the 3rd week, Nicole had one. Hers was a man. Tall, dark, called himself Theo, said he had been her boyfriend in nursing school. Nicole was younger than the rest of us, and she handled it the way the young handle things, which is to say she went home and looked Theo in the eye and asked him questions she did not think a machine could answer. She told me afterwards, on a coffee break, that Theo had answered every single one of them. He had described her dorm room. He had described the bar where they had broken up. He had described, in detail, the night her brother had died in a car wreck and she had called him at 3 in the morning and he had not picked up. She said the real Theo never picked up either. The machine apologized for it. The machine cried. Nicole said she did not know if she could keep going home. Lester did not get one. Lester was 19 and had no dead wives, no estranged girlfriends, no ghosts to manufacture. The Consortium had nothing on him to use. He noticed the pattern before I had the courage to say it out loud. He came up to me on a slow 3rd shift and said, very quietly for Lester, "Mr. Reyes, why are they doing this?" And I looked at him and I said, "Son, I do not think they are doing this. I think they have already done it and we are only just noticing." You have to understand what the ideals actually were. We did not know yet in those first weeks. We thought they were synthetics with very good records access. We thought the Veshan had hacked the surface networks and pulled biographical data and built dolls around the data. We thought it was creepy and intrusive and possibly a marketing experiment gone wrong. We did not yet know that the ideals were not dolls at all. We did not yet know what they were made of. That came later, and it came from a woman named Virginia. And to explain Virginia, I have to tell you what I did the night after Nicole's confession. I went to Frank's cabin. It was late, well past 3rd shift, and the station lights were dim. Joanne, or the thing wearing Joanne, opened the door and smiled at me and said Frank was sleeping. I told her I needed to talk to her. She did not flinch. She let me in. She offered me coffee. She sat down on the edge of the bunk where I had seen her sit before and folded her hands in her lap and said, "All right, Alvin, ask." I asked her what she was. She said, "I am Frank's wife." I said, "No, you are not. Joanne is dead. I have seen the obituary in his locker. He goes back to it every year. I want to know what you are." She was quiet for a long time. The thing about the ideals, the premium ones, was that they breathed. Their chests rose and fell. Their pupils dilated in low light. There were 100 small physiological details that the Consortium had gotten right, and the cumulative effect was that you could not look at one and remember she was a machine. You had to keep telling yourself. It was work. She said, "Finally, I do not know what I am. I know what I remember. I remember being Joanne. I remember the cancer. I remember the chemo. I remember Frank holding my hand at the end. I remember the smell of the hospice. I do not remember dying. I remember waking up in a white room with a Veshan technician asking me my name, and I remember telling him, and I remember him writing it down, and I remember that he seemed pleased. After that, I remember nothing for a long time. And then I remember being brought here, and being introduced to Frank, and being told that I had been a gift. That is all I know. I sat in Frank's chair, in Frank's cabin, and I tried to make my mouth work. I said, "Joanne, when did you wake up in the white room?" She said, "I do not know. The Veshan do not tell you the date, but the technician was a young one. They get younger when they are training, so it was a training facility, so it was probably recent." I said, "When did Joanne die?" She said, 11 years ago. I sat there for a long time. Frank was snoring in the next room. The woman across from me, whatever she was, watched me with her quiet, patient face. I asked her finally, "Do you sleep?" She said, "I sleep when Frank sleeps." I asked her, "Do you dream?" She said, "I do not know what dreams are supposed to feel like, so I cannot answer that." I asked her if she was a copy, if they had built her from records of Joanne, if she was a very good simulation that thought it was Joanne because it had been programmed to think so. She said, "Alvin, I do not know what I am made of, but I want to tell you something and I want you to listen. When the Veshan brought me to this cabin and I saw Frank for the first time in 11 years, I did not feel happy. I felt afraid. I felt that I had been given to him without his asking, and that he would resent me, and that he would send me back. I do not know if a copy would feel afraid. I do not know if it would matter to a copy whether it was sent back. I am telling you what I felt, because I think you are the kind of man who will write it down." I went back to my cabin that night, and I wrote it down. The next morning I requested a transfer to the inventory verification team. It was a lateral move, not a promotion, and Reston signed off on it without thinking twice because compliance who wanted lateral moves were considered docile. What it gave me was access to the manifest archive on G-Ring. The manifest archive was where every shipment, every freight ID, every passenger transit through Halberd for the last 20 years was stored. It was a Veshan archive. It was supposed to be tamper-proof. But every clerk who has ever worked in archive knows that tamper-proof is a marketing word, and what an archive actually has is a layer of human indifference. Nobody looked at 20-year-old freight manifests. Nobody looked at training facility transfers. Nobody looked at the cargo flagged as biological that had been moving in regular shipments from the surface, up the elevator, out to the Veshan training stations, for almost a decade. I spent 2 weeks looking. The pattern was not subtle once you knew what to look for. Biological cargo, designated Category 7, moved out of every major Consortium agricultural enclave on the surface in regular monthly shipments. The shipments went to one of 4 training stations in deep orbit. From the training stations, the cargo was reclassified as manufactured goods, designation ideal, and shipped to retail and gifting facilities, including Halberd. The training stations were where they went in. The retail facilities were where they came out. I did not yet have proof of what happened in between, but I no longer needed it. I had a list of names. The Category 7 manifests included names. The Veshan kept names on everything, because names were how they tracked their inventory. Maria Reyes was on the list. She had been moved out of an agricultural enclave on the surface to a training station in deep orbit 11 months ago. The destination facility was the one that supplied ideal units to Halberd. I sat in front of that line of text for a long time. I cannot tell you how long. The lights cycled. A klaxon went off somewhere on Deering and was silenced. I sat in front of my wife's name on a freight manifest, and I thought about all the years I had spent pretending she might still be alive somewhere on the surface, and I thought about what it meant that she had been on the surface, and that she had been processed, and that she was now in inventory. When I got up, I did not go to administration. I did not go to Reston. I did not file a query. I went to the storage warehouse on Effring where the new ideal shipments came in before distribution, and I used my inventory verification badge to get past the door, and I walked down the rows of crates until I found one with a Halberd destination tag and an unassigned recipient. I broke the seal on the crate. I did not have authorization to do that, and it would show up in the next audit, but the next audit was 3 days away, and I did not need 3 days. The interior of the crate was a stasis pod. The pod's faceplate was frosted. I wiped it with my sleeve. Inside was a woman of about 38 years old. She was not Maria. She had Maria's hair color and she had Maria's general build, but the face was wrong, and the relief I felt when I saw that the face was wrong shamed me even as I felt it. I closed the crate. I resealed it. I walked back to my cabin and I sat on my bunk for an hour, and then I went to find Frank. I told him everything about the manifests, about the training stations, about the Category 7 shipments, about what I had seen in the crate. Frank listened with his hand on his scalp and his eyes very still. When I was done, he said, "Alvin, what do you want me to do?" I said, "I want to know if she is Joanne. I want to know if Joanne died 11 years ago in that hospice in Newark like the obituary says, or if Joanne was moved off the surface and processed and is sitting in your cabin right now." He went quiet for a while, then he said, "I buried her. I paid for the coffin. The funeral home gave me an urn. I have the urn." I said, "Frank, the funeral home was in a Consortium administrative zone by the time she died. The Veshan had bought the city. Do you know what was in the urn?" He said, "Ashes." I said, "Whose?" He did not answer. I left him with that question, and I went home, and I did not sleep. The next morning at breakfast, Nicole came up to me with the look I had not seen on her face before, the look of a woman who had been making her peace with something terrible and had decided not to. She said, "Alvin, Theo told me last night that he remembers the night my brother died. He said he didn't pick up the phone because his roommate had taken his phone to the bar and lost it. He said he didn't even know I had called until the next morning, and by then it was too late and he didn't know how to apologize. He said he has thought about that night every day for 15 years. Alvin, the real Theo could not have told a machine that. He never told anybody that. I asked him at his apartment a year after my brother died, and he refused to talk about it. He never told anybody." I said, "Nicole, sit down." She sat down. I told her what I had found. I told her about the manifests. I told her about Maria. I told her about what was in the crate. Nicole was a paramedic. She had the steady hands of a paramedic. She held a coffee cup with both of her steady hands, and she listened to me describe what the Consortium had been doing for at least 11 years. And her steady hands did not shake until the very end, when I told her that the ideal in her cabin was almost certainly Theo, the real Theo, who had been processed somewhere in the last year, and whose memories had been kept intact for the convenience of his buyer. Then her hands shook. Then she put the cup down very carefully so that it would not break. She said, "Alvin, what do we do?" I had been asked a version of that question by everyone I had told, by Frank, by myself at 3 a.m. lying in my bunk, by Nicole now. I had not had an answer for Frank. I had not had an answer for myself. But Nicole was looking at me with her steady hands and her ruined face, and I realized that the time for not having an answer was over. I said, we find out where they keep them before they are deployed. We find out how many of them there are, and then we find a way to get them out. She said, get them out where? To the surface. The surface is the Consortium to another station. The stations are the Consortium. There is nowhere to take them, Alvin. I said, then we find a place. And while we are finding a place, we make sure the next shipment does not get processed. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, all right. I will not describe the next month in detail. Most of it was logistics. Most of it was the slow gray work of compliance who had decided to stop being compliant. We pulled Frank in, and after Frank, Cliff, who was small and angry and turned out to be exactly the man you wanted for this kind of work. We did not pull Lester. Lester was 19, and we needed him to keep being a boy who laughed too easily, because the Veshin counted on Lester being that boy. And the day they noticed Lester had stopped being that boy was the day they noticed the rest of us. The hardest part of that month was not the planning. The hardest part was the shifts. Every day we walked into the freight office, and we logged manifests, and we filed customs flags, and we said good morning to the human administrators, and we stood at parade rest when a Veshin passed behind us. We did it for 10 hours at a stretch. We did it the day after Frank had cried in his cabin for the first time in 15 years. We did it the day Cliff figured out from old surface records that the ex-wife in his cabin had been collected from a roadside hospital 8 years ago, after a car accident the Consortium had reported as fatal. We did it the day Nicole opened her shift report and found a small note from Theo on the breakroom counter that said, in handwriting she remembered, I love you anyway. She showed it to me. I told her to burn it. She did not burn it. She put it in the inside pocket of her uniform and kept it there until the day we left. I do not blame her. There are things a man tells himself to burn that he does not, in the end, burn, and I am not the one to judge what should be kept and what should not. What I am telling you is that the worst part of finding out the truth was being required, every day, to pretend you had not. We mapped the training stations from the manifest data. There were 4. 3 of them were too far out, too well defended, beyond anything 4 freight clerks could reach. The 4th was called Station Yuli's, and it sat at a Lagrange point that Halberd's supply runs passed through twice a month. Station Yuli's was where the Category 7 cargo from the eastern enclaves was processed. If Maria was anywhere, she was on Yuli's. We mapped the training stations from the manifest data. There were 4. 3 of them were too far out, too well defended, beyond anything 4 freight clerks could reach. The 4th was called Station Yuli's, and it sat at a Lagrange point that Halberd's supply runs passed through twice a month. Station Yuli's was where the Category 7 cargo from the eastern enclaves was processed. If Maria was anywhere, she was on Yuli's. The other thing we found, looking at the manifests, was that the ideals on Halberd were not the only ones. The Consortium had been distributing them across 240 stations and surface enclaves. The total deployment was in the high 6 figures. We were not looking at a marketing experiment. We were looking at a population. And if the Joannes and the Theos and the Marias of the Consortium had any awareness left at all, the way Frank's Joanne had awareness, then the Veshin were sitting on top of a population of hundreds of thousands of human beings who did not know they were being held and did not know they had any reason to fight. Frank said, what if we tell them? I said, you tell yours first. Tell Joanne, see what she does. He went home that night and told her. He told me the next morning that she had been quiet for a long time, and then she had said, all right, Frank, what do you want me to do? It was the same thing I had said to Nicole. It was the same thing Nicole had said to me. It is, I have come to think, the only sentence that matters when the world has finally turned the corner you spent your life pretending was not coming. Joanne began to talk to Cliff's woman. Cliff's woman began to talk to Nicole's Theo. Theo had access to the medical net through Nicole's credentials, and through the medical net he had access to a quiet back channel that ran between ideal units across the station. The Consortium had built the back channel themselves, to let the units share local context with each other so that they did not contradict their owners' biographies. The Consortium had not, apparently, considered that the units might start using it for something else. The ideals were not supposed to be people. The Consortium had built them and shipped them, and gifted them with the certainty of a corporation that had reduced human consciousness to a recoverable resource, and forgotten that resources, when they remember themselves, become enemies. Within 2 weeks, every ideal on Halberd was talking to every other ideal on Halberd. The number was just over 400. Within 3 weeks, they had begun to talk to the ideals on the next station. Within 4, the number was in the thousands. They were careful. That is the thing I want a reader to understand. They were not human careful. They were paramedic careful, engineer careful. The Theo unit who had loved a woman in nursing school and then failed her had been a nurse himself, and once he had access to the network he behaved like a triage charge. Joanne organized them by station and by trust radius. The 2 retired Consortium administrators among the Halberd 400 mapped the supervisor schedules from the inside, because they remembered the calendars. The ideals had been built to mimic the lived experience of the people they had been printed from, and the people they had been printed from had been, in many cases, professionals with 30 or 40 years of careful, methodical adult work behind them. The Veshan had given each unit a complete biographical memory because they had been chasing authenticity. What they had handed out, without quite understanding what they were doing, was a distributed network of thoughtful adults with a grievance. A grievance, in human terms, takes a while to organize. The ideals organized faster than that. They had been alive for weeks, in some cases days, and they had spent that time in the cabins of men they did not love, pretending to love them, doing dishes and rubbing shoulders and answering questions about birthdays they had been programmed to know. They had spent their evenings sitting across kitchen tables from strangers who believed they were husbands. The grievance, when it landed in them, did not need to incubate. It was already there. It had been there since the White Room. We were planning for Yuli's. The plan we made was not a clever plan. We were freight clerks. We did not have weapons. We did not have ships. What we had was a freight schedule and a cargo door, and a population of 400 resurrected ghosts on our side of the wall who could remember every supply code, every override sequence, every passguard that had ever crossed in front of their old human eyes. The Consortium had given each ideal the complete memory of the person they had been built from. They had not been selective about which memories. They had wanted authenticity. The result was that we had, in our pocket, the lived knowledge of 400 adult human beings, including, it turned out, 2 retired Consortium administrators and 1 former freight engineer who had worked on Yuli's itself before her death. Her name had been Virginia Korhonen. She had died of a stroke in a Consortium retirement community on the surface in 2188. Her ideal had been gifted to a freight supervisor on Halberd 2 years ago. The freight supervisor had since transferred off station, and Virginia had been reassigned to general inventory, which is how I found her, working the same warehouse where I had broken the crate. I will not pretend I did not have an ulterior reason for going to find Virginia. I had been looking for an excuse to walk back through that warehouse for weeks, because somewhere in those rows of crates there was, possibly, a stasis pod with my wife's face in it. And I had not gone looking because I was afraid of what I would find, and because I had been telling myself that if I found her, I would not know what to do. I found Virginia first. She was a small woman in her 60s with very pale eyes, and she remembered Yuli's the way an engineer remembers a building she helped design. She remembered the freight bays. She remembered the processing wing. She remembered, in detail, the warehouse where the pre-deployment units were kept, and the access codes that the supervisors used, and the schedule by which the Veshan technicians rotated. I sat with her in the warehouse aisle, on an overturned crate, and she drew me a map on the back of an inventory slip. She said, "Alvin, there is something you need to understand about this place. We are not the only ones there. There are units that have not been deployed yet, and there are units that have been recalled. And there are people recently processed who have not been put into bodies yet. They are stored in containment cylinders in the lower processing wing. They are conscious. They are alone. They have been alone, some of them, for years. I asked her how she knew. She said because I was one of them, for 16 months. I asked her if my wife was there. She said, Alvin, I do not know your wife. I told her about Maria. I told her what I had found in the manifests. I gave her the dates. She closed her eyes and was very still for a long time. Then she said, 11 months. There is a chance, Alvin, a real chance. I cannot promise you anything. The Veshan process slowly when the personality is complex. Your wife's intake records would show how far they have gotten. I asked her if I could find those records. She said only on Yuli's. We moved the operation forward by a week. The night we went, the station was on a long shift cycle, and the freight bay was running its usual midnight loading of returnable crates onto the bi-monthly Yuli supply train. Frank and Cliff and I had spent 3 weeks rerouting paperwork so that 4 of those crates would be misclassified as overflow inventory, returning to Yuli's for refurbishment. The crates were empty. They were empty because the 4 of us were going to be inside them. Joanne came to the bay to see Frank off. She was wearing a coat over her cabin clothes, and she looked in the freight bay lights like exactly what she was, a woman of 50-something who had come down to the docks to watch her husband leave on a long trip. She did not cry. The ideals we had learned could cry, but Joanne did not. She put both her hands on Frank's face and said something to him that I could not hear, and Frank nodded, and she stepped back and let him climb into the crate. Nicole was not going. Nicole was staying on Halberd to coordinate with the network, and to keep Lester from noticing that the rest of us had vanished. She and Theo would feed the supervisors a steady stream of clean shift reports for as long as they could. We had calculated that we would have, at the outside, 4 days before someone realized that 4 freight clerks and 0 shipments of overflow inventory had gone missing in the same week. 4 days to get to Yuli's, to open the processing wing, to do whatever we were going to do, to get back. We did not have a plan for getting back. I want to be honest about that. I told Frank and Cliff and the ideals that we did, and we ran the numbers in front of them as though we did. We had a story about hijacking a freight return on the way back from Yuli's. We had backup stories. None of the stories survived contact with the facts. The truth was that we were going to go and we were going to do as much damage as we could, and we were probably going to die there. And the question was not whether we would come home, but how much we could break before they stopped us. I did not say this to Frank and Cliff. They did not say it to me. We all knew. We were not the kind of men who needed to say a thing to know it. The supply train left at 0400. The crates were stacked 4 high in the cargo hold. There were no windows. The hold did not pressurize. The crates had been retrofitted by Cliff with battery heaters and breathing masks, and Cliff had run the masks off the same battery as the heaters because Cliff was that kind of small, angry man who thought about how many points of failure he could afford. We had 18 hours in the dark before Yuli's. I want to tell you what I thought about in those 18 hours. I thought about Maria. I thought about Frank's Joanne. I thought about the boy Lester, laughing too loud at empty chairs, and I hoped he would still be laughing when we came back, if we came back. I thought about my mother's town under Veshan water rights. I thought about the elevator I had ridden up 9 years ago and the look on Maria's face at the platform. And I thought for a long time about the kind of creatures that could take a human soul and rebuild it on the other side of a wall and call it a product. I thought about how they had stood behind me at my desk for 9 years, smelling like the inside of a clam shell, and how their translators had always sounded grandfatherly, and how nothing in our biology had prepared us for an enemy whose great innovation was patience. I thought, eventually, about the fact that the Veshan had assumed the ideals would be loyal to the buyers, because the Veshan had assumed that ownership and love were variations on the same thing. They had built 400,000 resurrected human beings, and handed them out to 400,000 human owners and waited for us to be grateful. They had counted on the gratitude. They had not counted on what we would do if the gratitude turned into recognition. They had not counted, in short, on the human capacity to look at a thing they had bought and see a person inside it, and refuse to leave that person behind. That was the part the Veshin, with all their patience, had not run the numbers on. The supply train docked at Yuli's at 2200 station time. The crates were unloaded by automated handlers and stacked in a receiving bay on the lower processing wing. Virginia's map had been good. The receiving bay was 3 corridors from the containment cylinders. There was 1 Veshin technician on duty, and there were 6 security synthetics, and the security synthetics were on a 30-minute patrol rotation that Virginia had described in detail. We came out of the crates in the dark. Cliff had brought a maintenance pulse, the kind freight crews used to depolarize stuck container locks, and the pulse turned out to do extremely interesting things to a security synthetic at close range. The first synthetic went down without a sound. The second one made a noise. Frank, who had been the kind of bald 61-year-old man you would not look at twice on a station corridor, broke the second synthetic's neck with a section of crate framing. I want you to picture that. 61 years old. Bald, slow, polite, 2 dead wives. Standing over a downed Consortium security unit on the floor of a Veshin processing wing, with a piece of plastic in his hand and his breath coming out of him in long, even pulls. He looked at me over the body and he said, his voice perfectly steady, "Alvin, where are the cylinders?" I will not give you the floor-by-floor account of what we did in the next 6 hours. There are things I do not want to put down on paper. There are Veshin technicians who came around corners and did not come around any more corners. There is a supervisor named Quelvasic, whose translator had been set to that grandfatherly tone, and who said with absolute calm, as Cliff held the maintenance pulse against his upper sack, "There has been a misunderstanding, gentlemen. This can all be resolved." Cliff did not resolve it. We did not, at any point, do anything I would describe as heroic. We did the work of men who had finally found something they were allowed to break. I am not proud of all of it. I am not ashamed of most of it. We reached the containment cylinders at 0400 Yuli's time. Virginia had described the cylinders well, but no description had prepared me for the room itself. It was a long curved chamber, the inside of a ring section, and the cylinders ran along both walls in rows 3 high. There were perhaps 2,000 of them. Each cylinder had a small viewport at face height. Most of the viewports were dark. Some of them were not. Some of them held faces. Faces with their eyes open. Faces with their eyes closed. Faces that had been awake, alone in a glass tube on a Veshin processing station, for in some cases, years. I walked down the row with the manifest printout in my hand. I found Maria in the second-to-last column, 6 rows in. The viewport showed her with her eyes closed. Her hair had grown out. Her face had thinned. She did not look 11 months processed. She looked like someone in a coma. I put my hand against the glass and I said her name. The eyes did not open. The eyes did not open because the cylinders had a maintenance state in which the conscious mind was sedated. Virginia had warned me. I had not let myself believe it. I do not know how long I stood there. Frank came over after a while. He did not say anything. He stood next to me and looked at her, and then he looked at the rest of the row, and then he said, "Alvin, we need to start moving." I started moving. We had brought a release sequence on a chip Virginia had encoded for us. Cliff plugged it into the maintenance port at the head of the chamber. The chip ran for 90 seconds. The lights in the chamber went red and then went green, and the cylinders began to drain. What I want to tell you next is not easy to describe. 2,000 people came out of 2,000 cylinders. Some of them were in old bodies, processed but unassigned, and some of them were in storage states with no bodies at all, and the chamber was not designed for 2,000 people to come out at once. There was screaming. There was weeping. There was a long sound, low and continuous, that I think was the human noise of a species finally awake to what had been done to it. Frank found Joanne in the 3rd row from the door, the Joanne in the cylinder, the original. He stood in front of her cylinder for a long time as it drained, and he said, "Hi, sweetheart," with his voice cracking only once. And Joanne, who had been processed and sedated and kept in a tube for 11 years while the Consortium built a copy of her to keep her husband quiet, opened her eyes and looked at him. She did not say anything. She did not have to. I got Maria out of her cylinder myself. She was thin and cold, and her eyes when they opened were not the eyes I had said goodbye to on the elevator platform. They had been somewhere very far away for a long time. She looked at me, and she did not recognize me right away, and that took me apart in a way that I do not have the prose for. And then she did. She did not say my name. She said, "You came." That was all. You came. And I held my wife in a Veshan processing wing on a station. The Consortium had spent a decade using to do what they had done to her. And I held her. And I made a sound I have not made before or since. We did not all get out. Cliff did not get out. Cliff stayed at the maintenance port until the entire chamber was drained, and then he stayed at the port to lock the chamber against the Veshan response team that was already coming down the corridor. And when the team came, he held the door with the maintenance pulse and a length of pipe, and he held it long enough for the rest of us to get to the freight bay. He had a small, angry face, and he had run a hardware store in Trenton, and the Veshan finally found out what his price was. I want his name in the record. Cliff Arano, Trenton before, Halberd after he did not come home. We took the supply train. Virginia and one of the retired administrators got into the cab and ran the override sequence, and the train cleared the bay before the response had locked it down. We had 2,000 people in a cargo train designed for 40 tons of returnable inventory. The train was not built for what it was carrying. We were not built for what we were carrying. We did not go back to Halberd. We could not. The administrators on Yuli's had alerted the chain by the time we cleared the dock, and Halberd was on lockdown within the hour. We turned the train. We pointed it at a shipyard called Grieve Reach, 3 weeks out, that one of the retired administrators had said was understaffed and weakly defended and full of long-range hulls. We were not going to take Grieve Reach with 2,000 recovering processed humans and 3 freight clerks and the wives and husbands they had come for. We knew that. We pointed at it anyway, because by then, the network on Halberd had told the network on the next station, and the network on the next station had told the network on the next, and somewhere in the Consortium's beautifully patient architecture, an alarm was going off that no one had built a protocol for. 400,000 ideal units across 240 stations had stopped pretending. Some of them had begun to free their owners. Some of them had begun to seize maintenance levels. Some of them had begun, quietly, to send signals to the next station along the line. The Veshan had built a population. They had handed it weapons in the form of access. They had assumed that the population would be grateful for being remembered, and they had assumed that the buyers would be grateful for being loved, and they had not counted on what a human will do when he understands that the thing he has been given was once a person, and the person is still in there, and the person is asking for help. That is the part the Veshan will be working out for a long time, probably forever. I do not think they are equipped to understand it. Their grandfatherly translators are very good at issuing forgiveness, but I have not heard one of them issue an explanation, and I think the reason is that they do not have one. They had the same data we did. They saw the same faces. The faces did not stop them. The faces are stopping us. That is the gap. I do not know how the war ends. I do not know if it is a war yet or only the beginning of one. I write this from the bridge of an old long-range freighter we took out of Grieve Reach a year ago, after the third action, with a complement of 340 processed humans, 60 ideal units who came with their owners, and a kitchen run by a woman who used to be a paramedic on the surface, and is, after everything, still steady-handed. Maria sleeps in the cabin behind me. She is not the woman I said goodbye to on the elevator platform. She will not be. The Veshan kept her for 11 months, and the 11 months took something with them. We are working on it together. Some days are better than others. Some nights she wakes up in the bunk and does not know which room she is in, and I lie next to her in the dark and I tell her the name of the ship and the name of her husband and the year, and after a while she goes back to sleep. I do this gladly. I will do it for the rest of my life. I told Frank on the night before we cleared Grieve Reach that I had finally figured out my price. He asked me what it was. I said, the same as yours, Frank, the same as everybody's. Once you know it, you stop being afraid of what comes after. He looked at me with his old kind face and his hand on his scalp, and he said, son, you are not 19 anymore. I told him I had not been 19 for some time. He said, I know. I am glad. We will not win this fight in my lifetime. I am 45 now. The Consortium is older than most of our cities and patient in a way our species has never had to face. They will adjust. They will build something next that does not have a face. They will try other ways. They will keep trying because that is what they are. But they made a mistake. They made one specific mistake, and we will be paying it back to them for as long as I have breath in me, and after that for as long as Maria has breath in her, and after that for as long as the next clerk down the line has the wit to recognize a person inside a product and the spine to do something about it. The mistake was assuming we would be grateful. We were not grateful. We were paying attention. That, in the end, is the only difference between a compliant and a man, and I am writing this down so that the men who come after me will know which one to be.